Lonely Cowboy hired her only to cook, but what she did next changed his life forever. Jack Thompson lived a life most people would call lonely. He was a cowboy, not by choice, but because life had slowly pushed him into it. His small ranch in the wide-open plains of Texas was far from any town or city, surrounded by nothing but endless fields, grazing cattle, and the occasional wild wind that howled across the land. The isolation was something Jack had grown used to, though it had left a quiet ache inside him that he couldn't shake. Jack was in his mid-40s. He had once had a family, a life filled with laughter and love, but that had ended years ago when his wife passed away unexpectedly. After her death, the ranch became both his home and his prison. Each day was a routine of chores, feeding cattle, mending fences, fixing broken equipment, but the nights were the hardest. The house was too quiet. The rooms echoed with memories that weren't his anymore. Even the walls seemed to mourn with him. Despite his tough exterior, Jack was a man who appreciated the little things that made life more bearable. A warm meal, a clean shirt, the smell of fresh hay. All these were comforts he had come to rely on. But he could not do everything. Running a ranch required strength, endurance, and skill. But cooking meals, washing clothes, and keeping the house in order required a different kind of effort. One Jack could no longer manage alone. After months of struggling to balance the ranch work with the chores at home, Jack made a decision. He would hire someone to help him, just to cook. He wasn't looking for a friend. Not yet. Not anyone to fill the void in his heart. He just needed someone who could take care of the kitchen, someone who could make meals for him and his small, modest life a little easier. Jack placed an ad in the nearest town's newspaper, a simple note: cook wanted for a small ranch. Must be reliable. Accommodation provided, nothing else required. He didn't expect many responses. After all, who would want to live in the middle of nowhere, working for a man who kept to himself? A few weeks later, a letter arrived. Maria Lopez, a woman in her early 30s, had written back. She was a single mother with a young son struggling to make ends meet. She had experience as a cook in various households and small restaurants, and she was willing to work hard to provide for her child. She made no demands, asked no questions about the ranch beyond where it was and what her duties would be. Jack was cautious when he first met her. Maria arrived in a small car, her hair tied neatly in a bun, her eyes alert and kind. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind of presence that doesn't demand attention but makes itself felt. Jack had not realized how much he had been missing simple human interaction until he saw her standing there, ready to take on the job. The first week was awkward. Jack was used to doing everything himself, and he had a routine that had not changed in years. Maria, however, was patient. She learned quickly, preparing meals that were simple but nourishing, and she did it without complaint or unnecessary chatter. Jack observed her from a distance, skeptical at first, but slowly he began to notice the little things she did. She cleaned with care, organized the kitchen efficiently, and always seemed to know what needed to be done next without being told. Maria, for her part, was focused on her work, but she was also quietly curious about the life she had stepped into. She noticed the worn furniture, the way the wind rattled the windows, and the faint sadness that hung over the house like a shadow. She did not pity Jack. Instead, she respected the man who had kept this ranch going all on his own. She admired his resilience, even if he did not show it openly. As days turned into weeks, their relationship began to change. Their conversations, which had started as simple exchanges about meals or chores, slowly began to include more personal topics. Jack talked about the ranch, the cattle, and the challenges of living alone. Maria listened, offering small insights and gentle encouragement. He began to realize that her presence made the house feel alive again, though he would never admit it aloud. One evening, after a long day of work under the hot Texas sun, Jack came inside to find Maria had prepared a special meal. The aroma of fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and a simple stew filled the house. He paused at the doorway, a small smile tugging at his lips, realizing he had not felt this warm and welcomed in years. It was more than just the food. It was the effort, the care, the thoughtfulness that Maria had brought into his home. For Maria, the ranch was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity. She had grown up in a small town herself, and she knew how to adapt and survive. She started to notice other areas where she could help: small repairs, organizing supplies, and even tending to a neglected garden outside the house. Jack was hesitant at first, not used to anyone taking initiative beyond the kitchen, but he soon realized her suggestions improved things in ways he had not considered. Despite the initial distance between them, Jack began to feel a sense of relief he had not experienced in years. He was still a cowboy, still alone in many ways, but the house was no longer a prison. The sound of Maria moving about, the laughter she shared with her son when he came to visit, and the smell of meals prepared with care gave him a small but significant comfort. Jack also began to notice changes in himself. He had spent years keeping his emotions locked away, believing that strength meant solitude and self-reliance. But watching Maria work and listening to her gentle words, he realized that strength also meant allowing someone else to help, to share the burdens that life had placed on him. He was not ready to let go of his pain, but he was beginning to see that life could be different, and maybe even better, with another person by his side. As the sun set over the wide plains, casting long shadows across the fields, Jack sat on the porch, looking at the horizon. He thought about the future, something he rarely allowed himself to do. The ranch would always require hard work, and the loneliness would never fully disappear. But now there was a spark of hope. Someone had entered his life, not to replace what he had lost, but to bring warmth, companionship, and a sense of purpose back into his days. That night, as he ate the dinner Maria had prepared, Jack felt something he had not felt in years: a quiet, steady gratitude. He did not know what the future held, and he was not about to rush into anything, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine a life that was not just about survival, but about living. Maria had come to the ranch for work, just to cook and help with the house, but in doing so, she had begun to change the rhythm of Jack's life. The days were no longer purely about labor and routine. They were about connection, shared effort, and the subtle joy that comes from another person caring enough to make life a little brighter. By the end of that first month, Jack had realized something important. Life was meant to be shared. He was not ready to admit it out loud, but the presence of Maria and her quiet strength had begun to fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. And though he did not yet know how this story would unfold, he felt the faint but undeniable truth. Change had arrived at his doorstep, carried on the shoulders of a woman who had only come to cook. After settling into the rhythm of the ranch, Maria's presence began to make a noticeable difference. Jack had started the week thinking she would simply cook the meals, maybe clean a few rooms, and leave him to his own world. But Maria's energy, care, and attentiveness extended far beyond the kitchen. She had a way of noticing things he hadn't thought of in years: the fences that were beginning to sag, the barn door that squeaked loudly in the wind, the small patches of weeds spreading across the garden. She quietly started fixing them one by one. Jack, at first, did not want to acknowledge it. He had spent years keeping the ranch running on his own. Accepting help felt strange, almost like admitting he was not enough. But the results were undeniable. The cattle seemed healthier, the barn looked sturdier, and even the garden, which had been neglected for years, was beginning to bloom. Jack would often find himself watching Maria at work, a sense of admiration quietly growing inside him. Maria, however, did not seek praise or recognition. She worked because she cared, not just about the ranch, but about the people in it. She had a natural instinct to nurture, and she found satisfaction in seeing the house become a home again. She also began to notice Jack's habits and routines, the little quirks that spoke volumes about his character. He would rise before dawn to check the cattle, his boots caked with mud, his shirt damp with sweat. He rarely complained, but Maria could see the weariness behind his steady gaze. One morning, Maria decided to make breakfast before Jack had a chance to start his day. She prepared fresh eggs, toast, and a small pot of strong coffee, placing it all on the table near the window. When Jack walked in, tired from checking the cattle, he froze for a moment. The warm smell of food, the neatness of the table, and the soft light streaming through the window made him pause. It had been a long time since someone had done something so thoughtful for him, without asking for anything in return. "Morning," Maria said quietly, her voice calm and cheerful. Jack nodded, unsure what to say. "Thanks," he muttered, taking a seat. He hadn't realized how lonely he had been until he noticed how comforting it was to have someone think of him like this. The days continued in this new rhythm. Jack focused on the ranch work, while Maria kept the house in order, cooked meals, and tended to small improvements. But gradually, the boundary between work and companionship began to blur. Their conversations, which had been short and practical at first, grew longer and more personal. Maria would ask about Jack's past, about his life before the ranch, and he found himself answering, even though he usually avoided such topics. He told her about his wife, about the days when laughter had filled the house, and about the heavy silence that followed her passing. Maria listened without judgment, offering small, comforting words that Jack had long forgotten how to hear. He noticed how her eyes reflected understanding and empathy, and he realized that he had begun to trust her in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in years. For Maria, the ranch was not just a job. It was a challenge and a learning experience. She had never worked on a ranch before, and the physical demands were unlike anything she had experienced in her past kitchen jobs. But she adapted quickly, observing Jack's methods and learning how to handle cattle, mend fences, and manage the property. Jack noticed her determination and the pride she took in learning new skills. He had always respected hard work, and seeing her willingness to step beyond her expected role made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Despite their growing bond, there were moments of tension. Jack was a private man, used to doing everything himself. He sometimes bristled at Maria taking initiative in areas he had always controlled. One afternoon, he found her repairing the barn roof without telling him. His first instinct was to scold her, but as he watched, he saw the careful, skillful way she worked, and he realized that her help was improving the ranch, not interfering with it. He swallowed his pride and simply nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. Maria also had her own worries. She had a young son, Miguel, who lived with her in the nearby town. She worried about leaving him, about how he would adjust to this new life, and about whether she was making the right decision. But each night, after the chores were done and the house was quiet, she would think about how far she had come. She had found a place where her skills mattered, where her efforts were seen, and where her presence could make a real difference. The turning point in their growing relationship began one chilly autumn evening. A sudden storm had rolled in, bringing wind, rain, and the kind of darkness that swallowed the plains whole. Jack was out checking the cattle, ensuring none had wandered off during the high winds. The storm came faster than expected, and the rain soaked him to the bone. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the vast fields in sharp bursts, and Jack struggled to keep his footing in the slippery mud. Maria noticed the sudden change in weather from the window. When Jack did not return after some time, worry surged in her chest. She grabbed her coat and ran toward the barn, braving the storm. The wind whipped her hair across her face and rain drenched her clothes, but she pressed on. When she reached the barn, she found Jack struggling to secure the last of the gates, his strength waning against the force of the storm. Without hesitation, Maria jumped in to help. Together they managed to secure the cattle and close the gates, their hands raw and aching from the cold and wet. They laughed nervously at the absurdity of the situation, but there was also a quiet gratitude in the shared effort. By the time they returned to the house, soaked and exhausted, they were more aware of each other than ever before. That night, Jack sat by the fire while Maria prepared hot cocoa for both of them. The warmth of the drink and the flickering light of the flames created a sense of comfort that Jack had not felt in years. He found himself talking about things he had kept buried: the loneliness, the endless labor, the weight of the ranch, and the quiet ache of missing someone he had loved deeply. Maria listened patiently, offering her understanding without forcing words or advice. For Maria, the storm was also a moment of realization. She had come to the ranch to work, to cook, and to make a living for her son. But she had also come to a place where she mattered, where her presence could impact someone else's life. She had seen the loneliness in Jack's eyes, the weariness in his hands, and she understood that her role was more than cooking. It was to bring warmth and hope to a life that had been too quiet for too long. In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened further. Jack began to accept help in ways he never had before, realizing that allowing someone to care for him was not a weakness, but a strength. Maria continued to contribute to the ranch, quietly improving things in her own way, without seeking recognition. They laughed together, shared small stories from their pasts, and began to anticipate each other's needs without speaking. The ranch, too, began to change. It was no longer just a place of work and isolation. It had become a home filled with life, laughter, and care. The cattle thrived, the barn was sturdy, and even the small garden that Maria tended grew greener and healthier. Jack could feel the difference, not just in the ranch, but in himself. He was beginning to understand that life could be more than survival. By the end of the second month, both Jack and Maria had realized something important. The lines between employer and employee had blurred. They were no longer simply man and cook. They were partners in the daily life of the ranch, supporting each other in ways neither had expected. Jack felt a warmth he had thought was gone forever, and Maria felt a sense of belonging she had not experienced in years. The days continued, filled with work, shared meals, and quiet evenings by the fire. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of ranch life, a transformation was quietly taking place. Jack's life, once defined by loneliness and routine, was slowly opening up to the possibility of connection, care, and maybe even love. And it had all begun with someone who had come to cook, with a simple desire to help, and a heart willing to make a difference. The turning point in Jack and Maria's story came unexpectedly, like a sudden gust of wind across the endless Texas plains. It was early winter, and the air had taken on a sharp chill that made every breath feel heavy. Snow had started falling lightly the night before, covering the fields in a quiet white blanket. Jack loved the winter's beauty, but it also made ranch work more difficult. The cattle needed extra care, fences had to be checked for weak spots, and every step across the slippery ground required caution. That morning, Jack set out before sunrise, determined to make his usual rounds. He wore his thickest coat, a wool scarf around his neck, and heavy boots that crunched in the newly fallen snow. Maria had prepared breakfast as usual, a simple meal of oatmeal, eggs, and hot tea. But Jack barely touched it, his mind focused entirely on the ranch and the animals. Maria noticed. her brow furrowed in quiet concern. She knew that Jack often carried more on his shoulders than he would admit. As the day progressed, the snowfall grew heavier. What had started as a gentle dusting became a steady fall, covering the fields in thick, powdery layers. Visibility was limited, and the wind began to bite through even the thickest layers of clothing. Jack continued his rounds, checking on the cattle in the distant fields, unaware of how quickly the weather was worsening. Maria, inside the house, began to worry. Jack had always been independent, insisting he could handle the ranch alone, but something about the storm felt different. She watched the snow swirl around the horizon, imagining Jack trudging through the fields, fighting both the cold and the slippery ground. Her heart raced with concern, and she knew she couldn't just wait. She put on her coat, wrapped a thick scarf around her neck, and grabbed a lantern. With determination, she stepped out into the storm. The wind whipped against her face, and snowflakes stung her eyes, but she pressed on. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, yet she didn't stop. She knew that Jack was out there somewhere, and she had to find him before something went wrong. After what felt like hours, though it had likely been only minutes, Maria saw him in the distance. He was near the edge of the fence, struggling to secure a gate that had come loose in the heavy wind. His movements were strong, but the storm was relentless, and he was soaked through, shivering from the cold. Maria called out, her voice carrying over the roar of the wind. Jack turned, relief flashing across his face when he saw her approach. "Maria! Maria! What are you doing out here?" he shouted, though his teeth chattered from the cold. "I couldn't wait inside," she shouted back. "I had to make sure you were okay." Without hesitation, Maria moved toward him, helping to hold the gate steady while Jack fastened it securely. Their hands brushed, cold and raw, but neither pulled away. They worked together in silence, the sound of the wind and snow masking everything else. Finally, the last latch clicked into place, and the gate stood firm against the storm. They both stood for a moment, breathing heavily, snow clinging to their coats and hair. Jack looked at Maria, a mixture of gratitude and awe in his eyes. He had faced storms before, but never had someone cared enough to face one with him. It was a moment that shook something deep inside him, a realization that he was no longer entirely alone, that someone truly had his back in a way he had never experienced. Maria smiled, brushing snow from her coat. "We should get back inside before we freeze," she said softly, her voice carrying both concern and relief. Jack nodded, allowing her to guide him back toward the house. Inside, they stripped off their wet clothes and warmed themselves by the fire. Maria made hot cocoa, adding a touch of cinnamon to warm them from the inside out. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the storm raging outside, the warmth of the fire contrasting sharply with the cold world beyond the walls. It was in that quiet moment that Jack finally began to open up. He spoke about the fear he had felt when he realized how strong the storm had become, about how vulnerable he had felt alone in the fields, and about the loneliness that had been a constant companion since his wife's passing. Maria listened, her eyes reflecting understanding and empathy. She didn't offer solutions or advice. She simply listened, letting him speak and be heard. For Maria, this was also a turning point. She realized that her role on the ranch was more than just cooking and cleaning. She had become someone Jack could rely on, someone he could trust with his fears and vulnerabilities. And in that moment, she understood that the bond between them was deepening in a way neither of them had expected. After the storm subsided, the next few days were filled with quiet reflection. Jack found himself paying closer attention to Maria's presence, noticing the small ways she improved the ranch and the house. He admired her patience, her dedication, and the gentle way she interacted with the world around her. Maria, too, felt a growing connection to Jack, appreciating his quiet strength, his determination, and the subtle warmth he allowed her to see. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a section of fence damaged by the storm, Jack paused and looked at Maria. He realized that he had begun to feel something he had long thought impossible. Hope. Hope that life could be different, that companionship could exist even after years of solitude, and that he could find happiness again. Maria noticed the change in him, though he did not speak of it. She could see it in the way he smiled more easily, the way he accepted her help without hesitation, and the way he began to share his thoughts and feelings. It was a quiet transformation, subtle but profound, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. The storm had done more than damage fences and make work difficult. It had revealed something essential about their connection. Jack had been reminded of his vulnerability, and Maria had been reminded of the power of care and presence. Together, they realized that life on the ranch could be more than work and routine. It could be about partnership, trust, and shared strength. That winter, as the snow melted and the plains began to show signs of spring, the ranch itself seemed to reflect the changes in their lives. The fences were stronger, the cattle healthier, and the house warmer than it had been in years. But more importantly, Jack and Maria had begun to change as people. They had discovered that they could rely on each other, that they could face challenges together, and that they could find joy in the simple acts of care and companionship. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories from their pasts and planning for the future. Jack spoke about his wife, his regrets, and his hopes, while Maria shared her dreams for her son and her own aspirations. They laughed together, sometimes in relief, sometimes in joy, and sometimes just at the absurdity of their situation. Two people thrown together by circumstance, learning how to trust and care for one another. By the end of that season, it was clear that the bond between Jack and Maria had deepened into something meaningful and lasting. The turning point of the storm had not only tested their physical strength, but had also strengthened their emotional connection. They were no longer simply man and cook. They were partners, allies, and slowly, two hearts beginning to heal together. Jack knew that his life would never be the same. The loneliness that had defined him for so long was being replaced with a sense of connection, trust, and hope. And Maria understood that her decision to come to the ranch had been about more than work. It had been about finding a place where her presence mattered, where her care could make a real difference, and where she could be part of something larger than herself. The storm had ended, but its impact would last forever. It had brought them together in a way that neither could have predicted, revealing the depth of their connection and the possibilities that lay ahead. For Jack and Maria, it was the moment that changed everything. The moment when life, with all its hardships and challenges, suddenly seemed filled with hope, purpose, and the promise of a future shared together. After the storm, life on the ranch seemed brighter, but with that brightness came new challenges and responsibilities. The snow had melted, leaving the fields muddy and the fences weakened. The cattle were safe, but a few had wandered too far in the storm, requiring days of extra work to round them up. Jack and Maria faced these challenges together, their bond growing stronger. But the pressure of the ranch and the demands of life were never far behind. Jack had always been independent, and accepting help was a constant struggle for him. He found himself hesitating before asking Maria to assist with tasks, even when he needed it. Pride and habit had taught him to manage everything alone, and though he trusted Maria, letting go of that control was not easy. He would sometimes fall into his old ways, trying to do things himself, and Maria, patient as ever, would quietly step in to guide him, offering her help without insistence. One afternoon, Jack decided to check the northern pasture, where the fences had been damaged during the storm. The ground was slippery from the melting snow, and the cattle had scattered into small groups. Maria insisted on coming along, not because she doubted his ability, but because she knew the work would be safer and quicker if they were together. At first, Jack resisted. He wanted to handle it alone, as he always had. But Maria's calm determination and the gentle way she insisted eventually convinced him to accept her company. The task proved more difficult than Jack had anticipated. The mud was thick, pulling at their boots, and the cattle were restless, moving unpredictably across the field. Jack found himself slipping, struggling to maintain control, and Maria's steady presence became a lifeline. She anticipated the movements of the animals, guided them with soft commands, and even offered a hand when he lost his balance. The experience reminded Jack that he did not have to face life's challenges alone, and that accepting help could make even the hardest work manageable. Back at the ranch, their cooperation extended beyond physical labor. Maria suggested improvements to the barn to prevent future storm damage, reorganized the storage of hay and tools, and even planted small patches of vegetables to supplement their meals. Jack initially resisted some of her ideas, skeptical of change, but he soon realized that her suggestions were practical, thoughtful, and effective. He began to see the ranch not just as a place of labor, but as a home that could grow, flourish, and thrive under their combined efforts. Despite these positive changes, life was not without conflict. Neighbors began to notice the unusual arrangement. A single mother working closely with a widowed man on his isolated ranch. Gossip spread, with some questioning Maria's intentions and others questioning Jack's judgment. At first, Jack felt anger and embarrassment, wanting to retreat further into his solitude. But Maria, calm and confident, reminded him that their lives were theirs alone, and that they did not need the approval of others to find happiness or stability. Jack slowly began to understand this lesson. He realized that fear of judgment had kept him isolated for years. By allowing Maria into his life, by trusting her judgment and care, he was stepping out of the shadow of fear and into a life that had the potential for connection and joy. It was not easy. Old habits die hard, and Jack often found himself questioning his choices, wondering if he was moving too fast or if he was risking too much. But Maria's presence was a constant reminder that change, though challenging, could be positive and life-affirming. The bond between them deepened further when a minor injury tested both their resilience. One morning, Jack slipped while repairing a fence, cutting his hand on a sharp piece of metal. The wound was deep enough to require immediate care, and for the first time in years, Jack needed someone to tend to him in a personal way. Maria acted quickly, cleaning the wound, applying bandages, and ensuring he rested properly. She stayed by his side, gently reminding him to take care of himself and not to push his body beyond its limits. For Jack, the experience was humbling. He had always prided himself on his strength and self-reliance, but the injury reminded him that even the strongest individuals need help sometimes. He realized that Maria's presence was not just comforting, it was essential. She brought balance to his life, helping him navigate the physical demands of the ranch while also nurturing the emotional resilience he had long suppressed. Maria, meanwhile, faced her own emotional challenges. She worried about Miguel, her young son, and how her growing connection with Jack might affect him. She wanted stability for him, and she was cautious about introducing too much change too quickly. But she also recognized the importance of living fully in the present, of embracing the unexpected joy that had entered her life. Balancing her responsibilities as a mother with her commitment to the ranch and to Jack required patience, courage, and careful thought. The turning point in their understanding of one another came during a long, quiet evening. The fire burned low in the hearth, and snow began to fall gently outside, covering the plains in a peaceful white blanket. Jack and Maria sat together, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. They spoke honestly, without pretense, revealing vulnerabilities that had been hidden for years. It was a moment of profound connection, one that deepened their trust and strengthened the bond that had begun during the storm. In the following weeks, Jack began to implement changes suggested by Maria. He repaired fences more efficiently, improved the layout of the barn, and even started keeping a small journal to track the health of the cattle and crops. Maria's ideas, once met with skepticism, now guided much of the daily operations on the ranch. Together, they formed a rhythm that balanced hard work, care, and companionship. Life continued to test them, however. A sudden outbreak of illness among the cattle required long nights of monitoring and extra care. Jack and Maria worked tirelessly, taking turns to ensure that each animal received attention. They faced exhaustion, frustration, and the fear of losing the livestock that sustained the ranch. But their partnership proved invaluable. They supported one another through the long hours, offering encouragement, sharing the workload, and finding small moments of laughter to lift their spirits. Through these trials, Jack came to understand the depth of his feelings for Maria. What had begun as gratitude and admiration was evolving into something more profound, a genuine affection born of shared experience, mutual respect, and the recognition that they complemented one another perfectly. Maria, too, felt the growing warmth in her heart, the realization that Jack was no longer just her employer, but someone who had become central to her life and her sense of belonging. By the end of the season, the ranch was thriving in ways Jack had never imagined possible. The fences were strong, the cattle healthy, and the house filled with warmth and laughter. But more importantly, Jack and Maria had learned to navigate the complexities of partnership. They had faced challenges together, relied on one another, and discovered that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful when shared. The consequences of their actions were clear. The ranch was better, their relationship stronger, and their hearts more open. Yet the journey was not over. They both knew that challenges would continue to arise, that life could be unpredictable, and that maintaining this newfound harmony would require constant care and effort. But for the first time in years, Jack felt ready to face the future. Not alone, but with someone who truly understood him, who supported him, and who had changed his life in ways he never thought possible. Maria, too, embraced this new chapter. She had come to the ranch to cook, to work, and to provide for her son. But she had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, belonging, and love. She had faced hardships, navigated social judgment, and stepped into a life that demanded courage and resilience. Through it all, she had discovered that small acts of care, cooking a meal, repairing a fence, offering support during a storm, could have the power to transform lives. Together, they had created a life that was richer, fuller, and filled with hope. They had learned that love and partnership were not just about grand gestures, but about shared effort, mutual respect, and the willingness to face life's challenges together. And though the future remained uncertain, they faced it with confidence, knowing that whatever came their way, they would face it side by side. Spring had finally arrived on the Texas plains, and the ranch looked different than it had in years. The fences were repaired, the fields were lush and green, and the cattle grazed peacefully under a bright sun. Even the house seemed brighter, warmed not just by the fire or sunlight, but by the presence of life, laughter, and care. Jack and Maria had worked tirelessly to restore not only the ranch, but also a sense of hope and balance that had been missing for so long. Jack had changed in ways he could barely put into words. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years was no longer as sharp, dulled by the warmth Maria had brought into his life. He had learned to accept help, to rely on someone else without feeling weak, and to see that vulnerability did not make him less of a man. In fact, it made him stronger, more capable of love and connection. Maria had changed too. She had come to the ranch for work, to cook and care for a home she had barely known. But she had found more than she expected. She had discovered a place where her efforts mattered, where her presence made a difference, and where she could be herself without fear of judgment. Her bond with Jack had grown steadily, a mix of trust, admiration, and something deeper, though neither had said the words aloud yet. The turning point that had begun during the winter storm now seemed far behind, yet its effects were still present in everything they did. They moved together with quiet efficiency, tending the ranch, caring for the cattle, and sharing responsibilities in a rhythm that felt natural. There was laughter, too, in small moments, a shared joke about muddy boots, the way the chickens would scatter at their approach, or Miguel visiting the ranch and marveling at the wide fields and animals. One morning, Jack stood on the porch, watching Maria guide Miguel as he learned to feed the cattle. He felt a surge of gratitude and affection, realizing how much she had changed not only the ranch, but his heart. He thought about the long years of solitude, the silent nights, and the heavy ache of loss, and he understood finally that her presence had brought him back to life in ways he had thought impossible. Maria noticed him watching and smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Are you enjoying the view?" she asked softly. Jack smiled back, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I am," he said quietly. I don't know what I would have done without you." Maria shook her head, laughing lightly. "We've done it together, Jack. That's the secret." It was true. Every fence mended, every meal cooked, every moment of patience and care had built a partnership stronger than either of them could have imagined. Their relationship had grown naturally, built on trust, shared effort, and the simple acts of caring that often go unnoticed but carry the greatest weight. As the weeks passed, the ranch continued to thrive. Jack found himself enjoying the work in a new way, not as a burden, but as part of a shared life. He took pleasure in teaching Miguel small ranch skills, guided by Maria's careful presence. Together they worked side by side, the rhythm of labor interwoven with quiet conversation, laughter, and moments of reflection. But beyond the practical aspects of ranch life, a deeper transformation was taking place. Jack had begun to understand that life was meant to be shared, that the loneliness he had once accepted as permanent could be replaced with companionship, love, and purpose. Maria had taught him, in ways both subtle and profound, that opening one's heart was not a weakness, but a source of strength. Maria, too, felt the change. Her life had been shaped by struggle, responsibility, and sacrifice, but the ranch had become a place where she could breathe, grow, and give love freely. She had come for work, but she had found a home, a family, and a future she could embrace with hope. The love she felt for Jack was quiet but steadfast, rooted in shared experience, mutual respect, and the knowledge that they had faced challenges together and emerged stronger. The first real test of their partnership after the winter storm came when a new opportunity arose. A neighboring ranch owner asked Jack to collaborate on a small cattle exchange, which required careful planning, trust, and negotiation. Jack initially felt hesitant. He had always been cautious and wary of outsiders, but Maria encouraged him, offering advice and practical support. Together they handled the arrangements, proving that their partnership extended beyond the home and ranch itself, into every challenge that life presented. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack and Maria sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, the wide plains stretching endlessly before them. The ranch was quiet except for the distant lowing of the cattle and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was the kind of moment that made Jack realize how far they had come, not just in rebuilding the ranch, but in rebuilding their lives. He turned to Maria, feeling a courage he had not felt in years. "Maria," he said softly, "I don't say this enough, but you've changed my life. You came here to cook, to help me with the house, and I never expected, well, I never expected this." Maria's eyes softened. "I feel the same, Jack. I didn't expect to find so much more than work. I didn't expect to feel at home again." There was a pause, filled with unspoken understanding. They had both come to the realization that their connection had grown into something rare and profound. They had faced storms, isolation, and uncertainty together, and through it all, they had built a bond that could not easily be broken. Jack reached for Maria's hand, holding it gently. "I don't want to imagine this ranch, or my life, without you in it," he said quietly. Maria squeezed his hand, a small smile on her face. "You won't have to. We're in this together." It was a simple declaration, yet it carried the weight of everything they had been through. In that moment, both Jack and Maria understood that their lives had changed forever, not because of grand gestures or dramatic events, but because of the small, steady acts of care, trust, and presence that had brought them together. The months passed, and life on the ranch continued to flourish. The partnership between Jack and Maria was strong, built on mutual respect, shared effort, and deep affection. Miguel, who visited frequently, thrived in the open space and warmth of the home, forming a bond with Jack that was both playful and meaningful. The ranch became not just a place of work, but a true home filled with laughter, care, and love. Jack and Maria's story became known in the small neighboring communities, not as gossip, but as an example of resilience, partnership, and the power of quiet acts of kindness. People admired the way they had faced challenges together, transforming not only the ranch, but their own lives in the process. Their bond was not about flashy declarations or dramatic gestures. It was about presence, trust, and the willingness to care for one another in small but meaningful ways. As the seasons changed, Jack often reflected on the journey they had taken, from the loneliness that had once defined him, to the storm that had revealed the depth of their connection, to the steady partnership that now shaped their lives. He understood that every moment, every challenge, and every choice had led them to this point. Maria had arrived at the ranch to cook, but she had brought so much more: hope, trust, companionship, and love. Maria, too, reflected on their journey. She had faced uncertainty, risk, and the challenges of adapting to a life far from the town she knew. But she had discovered that love and partnership were not just about grand gestures. They were about showing up, working together, and caring for one another day after day. She had found a home not only in the ranch but in Jack's heart, a place where her presence mattered and her efforts were cherished. In the quiet moments, as the sun set over the plains, Jack and Maria would sit side by side, watching the cattle graze and listening to the wind rustle through the fields. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding and unspoken affection. They had faced storms together, both literal and emotional, and had emerged stronger for it. Jack finally understood that life was not about facing it alone, but about sharing it with someone who truly cares. Maria realized that love could grow quietly, without rushing, without forcing itself into moments, but by simply being present, caring, and choosing to stay. Together they had found something rare, a life built on trust, effort, and the kind of love that transforms not just the heart but the soul. And so, life on the ranch continued, full of work, laughter, and quiet moments of joy. Jack and Maria had created a home and a partnership that would endure, proving that even in the most unexpected circumstances, small acts of kindness and care could change lives forever. The ranch was no longer just a place of solitude and labor. It had become a place of hope, love, and shared purpose. And Jack and Maria knew, deep in their hearts, that they had found something far more precious than either had expected: each other.